At 2,200 hours on November 17, 1944, Sergeant Mel Grevich stood inside a storage warehouse at Camp Tarawa, Hawaii, gazing at a row of damaged aircraft awaiting disposal. He was 26 years old, with 18 months of service in the Pacific behind him, and no innovations yet credited with saving lives. His battalion had lost 11 machine gunners in the previous 4 weeks during training exercises. The problem was rate of fire. The M1919S6 light machine gun weighed 32 pounds and fired 400 rounds per minute. German MG-42S fired 1,200 rounds per minute. Japanese Type 92s fired 450. American Marines were outmatched. Grevich had seen 3 gunners killed on Bougainville because they could not sustain suppressive fire rapidly enough. The enemy simply advanced through the pauses between bursts. Grevich was assigned to G Company, 28th Marine Regiment, 5th Marine Division. The regiment was preparing for the invasion of Iwo Jima. Intelligence estimates anticipated 21,000 Japanese defenders entrenched within 11 miles of underground tunnel. The Marines would land on black volcanic sand with no natural cover. Machine gun teams would be decisive, but the M1919S6 was too slow, too heavy, and too exposed. 3 weeks earlier, Grevich had approached his company commander. He explained that the M1919S6 required 3 men to operate effectively: a gunner, an assistant gunner to feed ammunition, and an ammo bearer to carry spare belts. If the gunner was hit, the entire fire team collapsed. The weapon was also difficult to maneuver during an assault. Marines had to halt, deploy the bipod, and only then begin firing. By that point, Japanese defenders had already fixed their position. The company commander listened and then asked Grevich whether he had a solution. Grevich did. He had seen one work on Bougainville 13 months earlier. In November 1943, he had served with the 3rd Parachute Battalion. Marines there had recovered M2 aircraft machine guns from wrecked dive bombers. These guns were designed to be mounted on SBD Dauntless aircraft. They fired .30 caliber rounds at 1,200 rounds per minute, 3 times the rate of the M1919A6. The barrels were lighter, and the weapons were engineered to be cooled by 300 mph airflow in flight. On Bougainville, a Marine named Private Bill Colby had simply attached a bipod to an ANM-2 and employed it as a ground weapon. It worked, but the gun still used aircraft-style spade grips, no stock and no proper trigger. It was usable, but awkward. Grevich and his platoon leader, Lieutenant Philip Gray, had modified one ANM-2 more thoroughly. They added an M1 Garand rifle stock, a bar bipod, and a fabricated trigger. The weapon functioned, but the 3rd Parachute Battalion was disbanded before it could be issued in combat. Grevich was reassigned to the 28th Marines, and the modified ANM-2 was left behind. Now, in November 1944, Grevich stood in that warehouse remembering what that weapon could do. The 28th Marines would land on Iwo Jima in less than 3 months. The M1919S6 would not suffice. He needed that ANM-2 modification again, but this time he needed 6 of them, 1 for each rifle platoon in G Company, 1 for the demolition section, and 1 for himself. His company commander approved the project, as did the battalion commander. Grevich was authorized to build the weapons, but there was a complication. He needed parts, ANM-2 receivers, M1 Garand stocks, bar bipods, trigger components, metal working tools, and he needed them without formal requisition paperwork. The modification was not standard issue. It was not approved by Marine Corps Ordnance. If Grevich followed official channels, the project would stall for months, perhaps years. He found Private First Class John Little, a machinist who understood tolerances and fabrication. Grevich explained what he needed. Little agreed to help. If you want to see how Grevich and Little managed to secretly build 6 unauthorized machine guns, please hit that like button. It helps us share more forgotten stories from World War II. Subscribe if you haven't already. Back to Grevich. The 2 Marines began combing the base. They needed 6 ANM-2 receivers, which were controlled items. Aircraft armament was supposed to be accounted for and turned in when damaged, but thousands of aircraft had been lost in the Pacific, crashed, shot down, or wrecked. Some had been salvaged. Parts sat in warehouses awaiting scrap or shipment back to the mainland. Grevich and Little started asking questions. They visited maintenance depots, salvage yards, and aircraft repair shops. They found 3 ANM-2s in a scrap bin, 2 more inside a damaged aircraft fuselage, and the 6th from a source Little later described as God knows where. By late November, they had 6 receivers, but they still needed stocks, bipods, sights, and triggers, with less than 10 weeks before the division shipped out for Iwo Jima. Every night after regular duty, the 2 Marines worked in a makeshift shop, and every night they wondered whether they would finish in time or be caught with unauthorized weapons before they ever proved they worked. The first modification began on November 21. Grevich and Little worked after dark in a corner of the battalion maintenance shed. The AN-M2 aircraft machine gun weighed 23 pounds with its spade grips attached. The receiver was designed to be bolted into an aircraft mount. There was no provision for a shoulder stock and no conventional trigger. The weapon fired via two butterfly triggers on the spade grips. That system was ideal in an aircraft turret but nearly useless for a Marine advancing across open ground. Little began by removing the spade grips, which were secured to the rear of the receiver with 4 bolts. Once removed, the weapon had no means of control. The next step was fabricating a trigger assembly. The AN-M2 fired using an electrical solenoid activated by an aircraft trigger. Little needed to create a mechanical trigger that actuated the same firing mechanism. He fashioned one from sheet metal, bent it to the correct angle, drilled mounting holes, and added a simple trigger guard made from scrap steel. The trigger was crude but functional. The stock was more complex. The M1 Garand stock was shaped for the Garand receiver, while the AN-M2 receiver had an entirely different profile. The rear of the machine gun included a buffer tube housing the recoil spring, protruding several inches behind the receiver. Little took a spare Garand stock and began cutting. He removed the forward section and hollowed out the rear to accept the buffer tube. The work demanded precision. Too loose and the weapon would wobble, too tight and the stock would crack under recoil. Little spent 6 hours on the first stock, using only hand tools, files, chisels, and sandpaper. When finished, the stock slid over the buffer tube with minimal clearance. He drilled mounting holes and bolted it to the receiver. The weapon now had a shoulder stock, but it still lacked sights and a bipod. The bar bipod was easier to adapt, it normally attached to a mounting bracket on the barrel. Little fabricated an adapter plate from 1/4-inch steel, allowing the bar bipod to fit the AN-M2 barrel shroud. He welded the adapter in place and tested deployment. It worked. The weapon could now be fired from the prone position. The rear sight posed another problem. The AN-M2's aircraft sights were rudimentary and unsuitable for ground combat. Little considered bar sights, but the bar's windage knob was on the right, while the AN-M2 required left side adjustment. Little located M2 heavy barrel machine gun sights in the parts inventory. These had left side windage. He modified the mount to fit the AN-M2 receiver and secured it to the top plate with screws. The final modification was the ammunition feed system. The AN-M2 was designed to be belt-fed from aircraft ammunition bays. Marines could not carry loose belts in combat. Little fabricated a 100-round ammunition box from sheet metal and mounted it to the left side of the receiver. A standard cloth belt could be loaded into the box and fed directly into the weapon. This allowed a single Marine to carry and operate the gun without an assistant. By December 5, the first weapon was finished. Grevich and Little took it to a remote section of the firing range. They loaded a 100-round belt. Grevich shouldered the weapon, aimed at a target 50 yards downrange, and pulled the trigger. The gun fired at 1,200 rounds per minute. The sound was sharp and distinct, faster than the M1919. The recoil was manageable with the stock, and the bipod stabilized the weapon. Grevich fired 3 10-round bursts, all landing within an 18-inch group. But there was a flaw. After 30 rounds, the barrel began to smoke. After 50, it was too hot to touch. After 75, the weapon stopped firing. The barrel had expanded from heat. The AN-M2 was designed to be cooled by high-speed airflow. On the ground, there was none. The barrel overheated in less than 2 minutes of sustained fire. Grevich and Little discussed solutions. They couldn't add water cooling. That would add weight and complexity. They couldn't change the barrel diameter. That would require machining equipment they didn't have access to. The only solution was to change how Marines used the weapon. Short bursts, 5 to 10 rounds maximum, allow the barrel to cool between bursts. It wasn't ideal, but it was workable. By December 20, they had completed 3 weapons. By January 5, all 6 were finished. Each weapon weighed 25 pounds, 7 lb lighter than the M1919A6. Each fired 3 times faster. Painted olive drab. Grevich named his weapon Betty Ann. The others received similar names. The names were stenkled on the receivers in white paint. On January 7, 1945, the 5th Marine Division boarded transport ships in Hawaii. The 6 modified weapons were packed in equipment crates. No official paperwork documented their existence. No Marine Corps armorer had inspected them. No ordnance officer had approved them. Grevich carried the maintenance manual for the standard AN-M2 in his pack. He hoped it would be enough if anyone asked questions. The convoy sailed west toward the Japanese home islands. And Grevich
Wondered if his unauthorized machine guns would work in actual combat or if they'd fail when Marines needed them. The convoy stopped at Eniwakato on February 5. The Marines conducted equipment checks.
Grevich inspected all 6 weapons. He test-fired each one at a makeshift range on the island.
All 6 functioned.
The overheating issue remained, but the weapons fired reliably in short bursts, 5 to 10 rounds,
5 to 10 rounds. This firing pattern would work for suppressing pillboxes in enemy positions.
On February 13, the
convoy conducted a practice landing on Tinian.
This was the final rehearsal before Iwoima.
Grevich brought all 6 weapons ashore during the exercise.
He wanted to see how they performed during an actual amphibious assault.
The weapons survived the landing, but the ammunition boxes took a beating.
Saltwater spray corroded the metal.
Sand jammed the feed mechanisms. Grevich and Little spent 2 days cleaning and waterproofing the boxes. They wrapped
the weapons in canvas tarps for the actual assault. On February 16, the convoy arrived off the coast of Iwoima.
The island was 8 square miles of volcanic rock. Mount Suribachi dominated the southern tip. Intelligence briefings estimated 21,000 Japanese defenders. Most were underground. The island had
been bombed for 74 consecutive days. Navy battleships and cruisers had fired thousands of shells at the beaches, but
reconnaissance photos showed the defenses were still intact.
The plan called for the 28th Marines to land at
Green Beach.
This beach was on the far left of the landing zone, directly below Mount Suribachi.
The regiment's mission
was to drive across the narrowest part of the island, cut off the mountain from the rest of the Japanese defenses, then assault and capture Suribachi itself.
The terrain was brutal. Black volcanic
sand that absorbed mortar and artillery impacts, steep terraces that channeled attackers into kill zones, pillboxes,
and bunkers covering every approach. Grevich assembled his fire team on February 18.
He explained how the
modified weapons worked. Short bursts only, never sustained fire. The barrel would overheat. The weapon would jam.
Marines needed to fire, pause, fire,
pause. Each gunner would carry 200 rounds in ammunition boxes. Additional ammunition bearers would carry spare belts.
The assistant gunners would monitor barrel temperature.
If the
barrel started smoking, cease fire immediately.
The weapons were distributed. 1 went to 1st platoon, 1 to 2nd platoon, 1 to 3rd platoon.
These were the rifle platoon of G Company.
1 weapon went to the demolition section.
Grevich kept the 5th weapon, Betty Ann. He would carry it himself during the assault.
The 6th weapon presented a problem.
G Company had 5 weapons, but Grevich had built
6.
The extra weapon needed a gunner, someone who understood machine guns, someone who could be trusted with an
unauthorized weapon.
The battalion commander suggested Corporal Tony Stein. Stein was assigned to a company, 28th Marines, different company, but Stein
had a reputation.
He was a toolmaker, a machinist from Dayton, Ohio.
He had
worked at Patterson Field and Dello Products before enlisting. He understood mechanical systems.
He had experience modifying equipment. Stein met with Grevich on February 18. Grevich showed
him the weapon, explained the modifications, demonstrated the firing technique.
Stein examined the trigger assembly, the stock fitment, the ammunition feed system. He asked technical questions. How much clearance in the buffer tube?
What grade of steel for the trigger guard? Whether the bipod mount could handle repeated deployment?
Stress? Grevich answered each question. Stein understood the weapon immediately.
There was speculation later about why Stein received the 6th weapon. Some believe Stein had helped with the construction, that he had assisted Grevich and Little during the fabrication process.
Little never confirmed this.
He only said that Stein was a machinist by trade, that Stein understood how the weapon worked, that he could be trusted to use it effectively.
The exact arrangement was never documented. On February 19 at
0400 hours, Marines began loading into landing craft.
The naval bombardment had resumed at 0640.
Battleships fired 16 inches shells at the beaches. Cruisers fired 8 inches shells at the terraces above the landing zone. Destroyers moved within 1,000 yards of shore and fired 5 inches shells at pillboxes. The noise was overwhelming, continuous.
The entire
island disappeared behind smoke and dust. Grevich stood in the landing craft with 42 Marines from G Company, Betty, and was wrapped in canvas. The ammunition box held 100 rounds. He carried 2 additional belts in a pack. Total weight 47 pounds. The M1919A6 with tripod and ammunition weighed 56 pounds and required 2 men to carry. Grevich's weapon was lighter, faster, and completely unauthorized. 30. The landing craft formed assault waves. The bombardment lifted. Naval gunfire shifted to targets inland. The first wave headed toward Green Beach. Grevich's craft was in the second wave, scheduled to land at 0915. He could see Mount Suribachi ahead, 550 feet high, black sand beach at the base. Smoke rising from the bombardment. No visible enemy fire. The beach looked empty. Intelligence had predicted moderate resistance for the first few hours, then heavy counterattacks once the Marines moved inland. At 0900, the first wave hit the beach. Grevich watched from 800 yards offshore. The landing craft dropped their ramps. Marines poured out, ran up the beach. Still no enemy fire. The beach remained quiet. Grevich wondered if the bombardment had worked, if the Japanese defenses had been destroyed, if the landing would be easier than expected. 15 minutes later, he would learn exactly how wrong that assumption was, and whether his unauthorized machine gun could do what no regulation weapon could accomplish. At 0912, Grevich's landing craft crossed the line of departure. The beach was 300 yd ahead. The first wave had disappeared into the terraces above the waterline. Still no enemy fire. The silence was unnatural. 42 Marines in the craft. Nobody spoke. The only sounds were the engine and waves hitting the hull. At 0914, the craft was 100 yards from shore. Grevich could see the beach clearly now. Black volcanic sand, steep terraces, rising 15 feet above the waterline, damaged landing craft from the first wave, but no Marines visible. They had all moved inland. The beach looked abandoned. At 9:15, the ramp dropped. Grevich was the third Marine out. His boots hit waist-deep water. The sand beneath was unstable. Volcanic ash mixed with larger rocks. Every step required effort. The weight of Betty and an ammunition made movement harder. He pushed forward 20 yards to the beach, 15 yards, 10 yard. The first mortar round landed at 0916, 40 yard to Grevich's left. The explosion threw black sand 20 feet into the air. The second round landed 5 seconds later, 30 yards to his right. Then the beach erupted. Mortars, artillery, machine gun fire from hidden positions in the terraces. The Japanese had waited, let the first 2 waves land, allowed the Marines to bunch up on the beach, then opened fire from prepared positions. Grevich reached the beach at 0917. He dropped behind a small rise in the sand, unwrapped Betty and deployed the bipod, scanned for targets. The enemy fire was coming from pillboxes built into the terraces. Concrete reinforced positions with interlocking fields of fire. The pillboxes were invisible until they opened fire. Then they disappeared behind smoke and dust. A Marine 20 feet to Grevich's right had an M1919A6. The gunner was trying to set up the weapon. The assistant gunner was feeding the ammunition belt. Both were exposed. A burst of Japanese machine gun fire hit the assistant gunner. He went down. The primary gunner grabbed the weapon and tried to reposition. A second burst hit him in the chest. The M1919A6 fell into the sand. The fire team was eliminated in 8 seconds. Grevich identified the Japanese position. Uphill. Box 70 yard inland. Firing port 6 in high, 2 feet wide. He shouldered. Betty Ann, aimed at the firing port, pulled the trigger. 10 rounds, 1 second. The distinctive sound of the AN-M2 cut through the noise of the beach. 1,200 rounds per minute. The tracer showed. Every 5th round, all 10 rounds impacted around the firing port. The Japanese gun stopped firing. Grevich paused, let the barrel cool for 5 seconds, acquired a second target, a machine gun position 80 yard to the left, fired another 10-round burst. The position went silent. He shifted to a third target. Fired. Shifted again, fired. Each burst was deliberate. Controlled, short enough to prevent overheating, long enough to suppress the target.
the difference was immediately apparent.
The M1919A6 fired 400 rounds per minute.
A 10-round burst took 1.5 seconds.
Betty Ann fired the same 10 rounds in 8 seconds, half the exposure time, half the time for enemy gunners to acquire Gravich's position. The higher rate of fire also created better
suppression. Japanese defenders couldn't return fire effectively when 1,200 rounds per minute were impacting around their position.
Other Marines with the modified weapons began engaging targets.
Grevich could hear the distinctive sound of the A&M-2S across the beach. Higher pitch than the M1919. Faster cycling.
The 6 weapons were spread across Green Beach with different companies and platoon, but all 6 were
firing.
All 6 were working. By 0930, elements of the 28th Marines had pushed
inland.
The beach was still under fire, but the volume had decreased. The modified weapons had suppressed enough
positions to create gaps in the Japanese defensive fire.
Marines exploited those gaps, moved forward, established
positions in the terraces. Grevich's ammunition box was empty. 100 rounds
expended in 15 minutes.
He reloaded with a fresh belt. The barrel of Betty Ann was hot.
Not critical yet, but approaching the limit. He would need to reduce his rate of fire.
Give the barrel more time to cool between bursts.
At 0945, a Marine runner reached Grevich's
position. The runner was from a company.
He reported that Corporal Stein was engaging pillboxes on the right flank.
Stein had already made 3 trips back to the beach for more ammunition.
Each trip, he brought a wounded Marine with him. Stein was running without his helmet, without his boots, trying to move faster under fire.
Grevich
acknowledged the report. He wondered how long the weapons would last. The barrels were thin, designed for aircraft use
with forced air cooling. Combat on Uoma was different.
Sustained fire, limited
cooling, high ambient temperature from volcanic activity. The island itself was hot. Steam rose from cracks in the ground.
The combination of combat heat and environmental heat was beyond anything the weapons were designed to
handle. At 1,000 hours, Grevich heard a different sound. Not the crack of rifle
fire or the thump of mortars.
This was a scream, high-pitched, inhuman, coming
from Japanese positions inland. Marines later reported hearing similar sounds throughout the first day.
Some believe
it was Japanese soldiers reacting to the modified weapons. The rate of fire was unfamiliar. The sound was unfamiliar. The effectiveness was beyond what they had encountered from standard American machine guns. Whether the Japanese actually called them monster guns would never be confirmed, but the psychological effect was undeniable, and Grevich knew his weapon was working exactly as designed. The question now was whether it could sustain that
performance for the days of fighting ahead. 1,100 hours on February 19, all 6 modified weapons were in continuous use.
The gunners had learned to manage the overheating problem.
5 to 10 round bursts, 15-second cooling intervals.
The technique worked.
Barrels stayed within operating temperature.
The weapons maintained function. The tactical advantage was significant.
Standard American machine guns required a crew of 3. 1 gunner, 1 assistant to feed ammunition, 1 bearer to carry spare
belts. The modified weapons required only 1 Marine. The gunner carried the
weapon and ammunition.
The 100-round box eliminated the need for an assistant feeder.
This meant rifle squads could
maintain full strength while still having machine gun support. The weight reduction also mattered, 25 pounds versus 32. A Marine could carry the weapon and still move quickly across broken terrain.
The 1st platoon gunner engaged a pillbox complex northeast of Green Beach at 11:30.
The position held
3 interlocking firing ports. Japanese defenders had clear fields of fire covering the approach to the terraces.
The gunner advanced to within 60 yards, fired a 15-round burst at the center port, shifted left, fired at the second port, shifted right, fired at the
third port. Total engagement time 12 seconds. All 3 ports went silent.
The platoon advanced through the gap. The 2nd platoon gunner worked with a demolition team at 1,200 hours. The team was tasked with destroying a concrete bunker built into the base of a terrace. The bunker had a steel door, reinforced walls. The demolition team needed to place charges directly against the door, but Japanese fire from adjacent
positions prevented approach. The gunners suppressed 4 positions in sequence: short bursts, rapid target transition.
The demolition team reached the bunker, placed charges, withdrew.
The bunker was destroyed at 12:15. The 3rd platoon gunner encountered the overheating limit at 12:30. He had been firing almost continuously for 90 minutes.
The barrel temperature exceeded safe limits.
The weapon jammed. The gunner cleared the jam, attempted to resume firing. The weapon jammed again. He stopped, let the barrel cool for 10 minutes.
The weapon resumed function.
But the incident highlighted the fundamental limitation.
The AN-M2 barrel was designed for short bursts in aircraft combat, not sustained
ground fire. Gunners had to discipline themselves. Short bursts, long pauses. It was the only way to keep the weapons operational.
The demolition section gunner used his weapon to cover engineer
teams clearing obstacles. Japanese defenders had placed mines and wire obstacles across approach routes. Engineers needed to clear these obstacles under fire. The gunner provided suppression. He fired at Japanese positions, forced the defenders to take cover.
The engineers completed their work.
By 1300 hours, 3 major obstacle belts had been cleared. The 28th Marines pushed deeper inland. Grevich continued engaging targets throughout the afternoon.
Bedian had fired approximately 400 rounds by 1400 hours. The barrel showed signs of wear, heat discoloration near the chamber, slight warping along the length, but the weapon still functioned. Grevich monitored the barrel carefully.
He reduced his burst length to 5 rounds, increased cooling time to 20 seconds. The modified firing pattern kept the barrel within limits. Tony Stein's performance on the right flank became notable by mid-afternoon. Stein was
using his modified weapon to attack pillboxes directly. His technique was aggressive. He would identify a pillbox, advance to close range, fire sustained bursts at the firing port, then rush the
position with grenades while Japanese defenders were suppressed.
The method worked, but it consumed ammunition
rapidly.
Stein made 8 trips back to the beach for resupply by 1500 hours.
Each trip covered approximately 200 yards under fire. Each trip, he brought back wounded Marines who couldn't walk on their own.
The psychological effect of the weapons became apparent during
the afternoon fighting. Japanese defenders responded differently to the modified weapons than to standard machine guns.
The rate of fire was triple what they expected. The sound was distinct, higher pitched, more intense.
Several Marines reported hearing Japanese soldiers shouting during firefights.
The exact words were unclear, but the tone suggested surprise or alarm.
Whether this translated to actual fear was impossible to confirm. What was confirmed was effectiveness.
The 6 weapons had suppressed dozens of positions, enabled multiple advances, supported breakthroughs that standard weapons could not achieve.
By 1600 hours, the 28th Marines had achieved their D-Day objective.
They had crossed the 800-yard neck of the island.
Mount Suribachi was isolated from the main Japanese defenses.
The regiment had suffered heavy casualties, but they held their positions, prepared to assault the
mountain the following morning.
Grevich inspected Betty, and at 16:30,
the
barrel was damaged. Heat stress had caused microfractures along the chamber.
The weapon was still
functional, but it wouldn't last much longer. He estimated maybe 2 more days of combat before barrel failure.
The other 5 weapons showed similar wear. Little examined each weapon that evening.
His assessment was consistent. The barrels were failing faster than expected.
The weapons had maybe 48 hours of service life remaining. After that,
they would need replacement barrels, but there were no replacement barrels.
The AN-M2 aircraft gun wasn't designed for field maintenance.
If the barrels failed, the weapons were finished and the 28th Marines would be back to
standard machine guns,
slower, heavier, less effective.
Grevich wondered if 6
weapons in 2 days would be enough or if they'd burn out before the real fighting even began.
February 20th began at 0600 with a cold rain. The 28th Marines prepared to
assault Mount Suribachi from 3 directions. The mountain was 550 feet of volcanic rock honeycombed with caves and
tunnels.
Japanese defenders had artillery positions, machine gun nests, mortar pits, all connected by
Underground passages. The Marines would have to fight uphill across open ground with minimal cover. Grevich's fire team moved out at 0730. Their mission was to suppress positions on the eastern slope while rifle squads advanced. Betty Ann had cooled overnight.
The barrel still showed heat damage, but the weapon cycled normally during a pre-assault.
Function check.
Grevich loaded a fresh 100-round belt. He calculated he had enough ammunition for 10 to 12
engagements before requiring resupply. The advance began slowly. Japanese positions opened fire from concealed locations, mortars, machine guns, rifles. The terrain channeled the Marines into narrow corridors. Every corridor was covered by overlapping fire. The modified weapons became critical for breaking these defensive positions. Grevich would identify a Japanese machine gun, fire a 10-round burst. The Japanese gun would stop firing. Rifle squads would advance 20 yards, then another position would open fire. Grevich would suppress it. The process repeated continuously. By 0900, 3 of the 6 modified weapons had suffered malfunctions. The first platoon weapon experienced a barrel split. The thin aircraft barrel couldn't handle the sustained heat and pressure. The weapon was inoperable. The gunner switched to a standard M1 The rate of fire dropped immediately.
The demolition section weapon had a feed mechanism failure.
Sand and volcanic dust had accumulated in the ammunition box.
The belt jammed during feeding.
The gunner spent 15 minutes clearing the jam. The weapon resumed function but required constant cleaning.
The 3rd platoon weapon overheated critically at 0930.
The gunner had been engaging targets continuously for 40 minutes. He didn't allow sufficient cooling time between bursts.
The barrel temperature exceeded critical limits. Metal fatigue caused the barrel to warp.
Rounds began keyholing.
Accuracy degraded beyond useful range.
The gunner attempted to continue firing.
The weapon jammed
permanently.
He abandoned it and picked up a rifle from a wounded Marine.
3 weapons remained functional. Grevich's Betty Ann, the 2nd platoon weapon, and Tony Stein's weapon on the western approach. These 3 weapons carried
the burden of machine gun support for the entire regiment during the morning assault.
The loss of the other 3
weapons forced tactical adjustments. Rifle squads had to provide their own suppressive fire using M1 Garands and
bars. Advance rate slowed. Casualties increased. Grevich's ammunition supply became critical at 1,000 hours.
He had fired 600 rounds since 0730.
His last ammunition belt had 75 rounds remaining. No resupply was immediately available.
The beach was 300 yards behind the front line.
Enemy mortar fire covered the route. Ammunition bearers couldn't advance safely. Grevich had to conserve ammunition. He reduced burst length to 3 rounds, selected only critical
targets, positions that directly threatened advancing Marines.
The 2nd platoon weapon failed at 1045. The trigger assembly broke. The sheet metal fabrication couldn't withstand repeated firing stress. The trigger snapped off. At the mounting point, the gunner attempted field repair. He tried to manually activate the firing solenoid. It didn't work. The weapon was finished. The 2nd platoon lost its machine gun support. Betty Ann and Stein's weapon were the last 2 functioning. Grevich was on the eastern slope.
Stein was on the western slope.
They couldn't
coordinate, couldn't support each other.
Each was isolated with his respective unit. Each had limited ammunition. Each had a damaged weapon that could fail at any moment. Grevich's last belt ran out at 11:20. 75 rounds gone in 6 engagements. The ammunition box was empty. He searched for resupply, found a
wounded Marine carrying spare belts for a standard M1919. The belts were compatible.
Grevich
loaded 1, fired a test burst.
Betty Ann cycled normally. He had 200 rounds remaining.
After that, the weapon became useless metal. The assault on Surbachi
continued through the afternoon.
Progress was measured in yards.
Every cave entrance had to be cleared. Every pillbox destroyed. Every tunnel sealed. The Marines used flamethrowers, demolitions, direct fire from tanks.
The modified weapons, when they were still functional, had provided critical fire support during the initial advance.
But by mid-afternoon on February 20th,
only 2 weapons remained operational, and both were running on borrowed time.
By 1700 hours, the 28th Marines had advanced 200 yards up the mountain. They held positions halfway to the summit. Casualties were severe. The regiment had lost 430 Marines killed or wounded in 2 days. The advance would continue the next morning, but Grevich knew Betty and wouldn't last another day. The barrel was visibly warped. The receiver showed stress cracks. The trigger assembly was loose. He estimated the weapon had maybe 50 rounds of life remaining. After that, he would be carrying 25 pounds of inoperable equipment, and the 28th Marines would have one fewer weapon to break through Japanese defenses. The Marines would take Suribachi, but they would do it with standard weapons. The modified guns had done their job. Now they were dying one barrel at a time, one engagement at a time, until nothing remained but the idea that 2 Marines with hand tools had built something the Marine Corps Armory never could. Betty Ann fired its last rounds on February 21 at 0815. Grevich was suppressing a machine gun nest on the northern slope of Suribachi. He loaded his final ammunition belt, 50 rounds. He fired 3 10-round bursts. The Japanese position went silent. Grevich attempted a 4th burst. The weapon jammed. He cleared the stoppage, pulled the trigger again. Nothing. The firing solenoid had failed. Electrical connections severed by sustained vibration and heat stress. Betty Ann was finished. Grevich set the weapon aside. He picked up an M1 Garand from a wounded Marine. For the next 2 days, he fought with a rifle. The weapon he had spent 3 months designing and building had lasted 72 hours in combat. 3 days. But those 3 days had mattered. Tony Stein's weapon lasted longer. Stein continued using his modified gun through February 23. That was the day the 28th Marines reached the summit of Mount Suribachi. A 40-man patrol from E Company made the climb at 0800. They carried a small American flag. At 10:20, the flag was raised on the summit. Photographers captured the moment. Later that afternoon, a second, larger flag was raised. Associated Press photographer Joe Rosenthal photographed the second flag raising. That image became one of the most recognized photographs in American history. Stein's weapon failed on February 24. Barrel fracture. Complete structural failure near the chamber. The weapon literally split apart during firing. Stein was uninjured, but the gun was destroyed. He switched to a standard M19 19A6 for the remainder of the Suribachi fighting. By February 26, all 6 modified weapons were non-functional. 4 had barrel failures, 1 had a broken trigger assembly, 1 had a catastrophic receiver crack that rendered it unsafe to fire. The 28th Marines collected the damaged weapons. They were supposed to be turned into battalion armory for documentation, but the weapons were never officially registered. No serial numbers, no property books, no maintenance records. The damaged weapons disappeared, possibly discarded with other battle-damaged equipment, possibly buried in the volcanic sand. The exact fate was never documented. Stein returned to combat after Suribachi was secured. The 28th Marines moved to the northern sector of the island. The fighting escalated. Japanese defenders had constructed extensive cave networks. Machine gun emplacements covered every approach. Advancement slowed to mere yards per day. Casualties accumulated. On March 1, Stein volunteered to lead a 19-man patrol. The mission was to locate and neutralize a Japanese machine gun stronghold that had pinned down a company. Stein moved forward with the patrol at 1,400 hours. The team navigated broken terrain north of Hill 362A. Japanese positions were hidden in caves and foxholes. The patrol came under fire from multiple directions. Stein identified the primary machine gun nest. He was using a standard weapon now, not his modified gun. The firing rate was slower, suppression less effective. He advanced toward the position. A Japanese sniper in concealment fired a single round. It struck Stein in the head. He was killed instantly, only 23 years old, 14 days after landing on Iwo Jima. The recommendation for Stein's Medal of Honor was submitted on March 15. His platoon leader authored the initial citation. The citation detailed Stein's actions on February 19, the first day of the invasion. Stein had been armed with a personally improvised aircraft-style weapon. He provided covering fire for his platoon, made 8 trips to the beach for ammunition,
and on each trip carried wounded Marines to safety.
He had killed at least 20 Japanese defenders, destroyed multiple pillboxes, and stood upright under fire to draw enemy attention and pinpoint their positions.
The citation made no mention of Grevich, no mention of Little, no mention of the 3 months of preparation in Hawaii, no mention of the unauthorized fabrication, no mention of the other 5 weapons. It described the weapon as personally improvised, implying Stein had built it himself. Technically accurate, Stein had used the weapon personally, but the wording suggested sole authorship, which was incorrect. The Medal of Honor recommendation moved up the chain of command.
Battalion commander approved it. Regimental commander approved it. Division commander approved it. Fleet Marine Force Pacific commander approved it. Pacific Fleet Admiral Chester Nimitz approved it. Chief of Naval Operations approved it.
Secretary of the Navy approved it.
President Harry Truman signed the final authorization.
On February 19, 1946, exactly 1 year after the landing, Stein's widow received the Medal of Honor at a ceremony in Columbus, Ohio.
Governor Frank Losh presented the award. Admiral Richard Pennoyer placed the medal around her neck. Newspapers across the United States published the citation.
The story focused on Stein, his courage, his sacrifice, his improvised weapon. The narrative was compelling. A toolmaker from Dayton who modified an aircraft gun to save his platoon. The story was true, but incomplete. 2 other Marines had designed the weapon, built 6 of them, and distributed them to gunners throughout the regiment. Those 2 Marines were never mentioned in the citation, never in news coverage, never in the historical record that followed. Mel Grevich and John Little had created the weapon that earned Tony Stein a Medal of Honor, but history remembered only Stein. The reason Grevich and Little disappeared from history was simple. They survived. Stein died. The Medal of Honor is almost always awarded posthumously. Of the 464 Medals of Honor given during World War II, 324 went to men who died earning them.
Citations narrate the recipients' final moments, the heroic acts that cost them their life.
That story is powerful, compelling. Grevich survived. He fought through the entire 36-day campaign.
He was wounded twice. Neither injury required evacuation. He returned to Hawaii with the 5th Marine Division in March 1945. The division prepared for the invasion of Japan, Operation Olympic, scheduled for November 1, 1945. Japan surrendered in August.
Grevich never spoke publicly about the modified weapons. He was discharged in 1946, returned to Mountain Iron, Minnesota, lived a quiet life, and died in the 1980s. His obituary made no mention of the Stinger.
John Little also survived.
He fought on Iwo Jima with H Company, 28th Marines. He was at the base of Mount Suribachi during the flag raising and witnessed both flags go up on February 23.
After the war, he returned to civilian life and became a home builder in California.
He rarely discussed his combat experience. In his later years, he confirmed his role in building the weapons but never sought recognition, never contacted historians, never tried to correct the record.
He died in 2015.
His obituary mentioned only that he was a decorated Iwo Jima survivor, nothing about the Stinger. The Marine Corps never officially adopted the modified AN-M2 design. After Iwo Jima, there were proposals to produce the weapon in larger numbers, replace the bar and rifle squads, and issue 1 modified weapon per platoon.
The recommendations were reviewed by ordnance evaluators.
They identified the main problem: the barrel.
Aircraft barrels could not endure extended ground combat.
The weapons worked for brief engagements but failed during sustained use.
Constant barrel replacements would have been necessary.
The logistics were impractical. The Marine Corps continued using the M1919A6 through the end of World War II. The weapon was heavy and slow, but reliable. It could fire continuously without barrel failure. Reliability mattered more than rate of fire. After the war, the Marine Corps developed new weapons. The M60 machine gun entered service in 1957. It offered greater portability than the M1919, a faster rate of fire, and a quick-change barrel system. The M60 incorporated lessons learned from earlier weapons like the Stinger, though the Stinger itself was largely forgotten. Military historians uncovered the Stinger story decades later. They found references in unit records. After-action reports mention modified weapons used by the 28th Marines, but the reports did not identify Grevich or Little. They credited Stein because his Medal of Honor citation provided the most detailed documentation. The phrase "personally improvised" led historians to assume individual fabrication. It took years of research, interviews with surviving Marines, analysis of technical specifications, an examination of who had the expertise and access to construct such weapons to reveal Grevich and Little's contribution. Today, only 1 Stinger replica exists. It was built by the Canadian Historical Arms Museum for a television documentary.
Constructing the replica took 3 months.
Modern machinists with complete workshops and reference materials required 90 days to reproduce what Grevich and Little had built by hand in just 10 weeks. The replica demonstrated the weapon's capabilities: 1,200 rounds per minute, controllable recoil, accurate fire, but also confirmed the overheating problem.
After 75 rounds, the barrel exceeded safe temperature limits. The replica validated historical accounts.
The original 6 weapons were never recovered. They vanished on Iwo Jima, destroyed in combat, discarded as battle damage, or buried in volcanic sand. No serial numbers were recorded.
No maintenance logs survived. The weapons existed for 3 months, fought for 3 days, and then disappeared.
Only the story remained.
If this story moved you as it moved us, do us a favor, hit that like button.
Every like tells YouTube to share this story with more people.
Subscribe and turn on notifications.
We are rescuing forgotten stories from dusty archives every day, stories about sergeants and machinists who saved lives with improvised weapons and countless nights of work.
Real people, real heroism. Drop a comment and tell us where you are watching from. Are you in the United States, United Kingdom, Canada, or Australia?
Our community spans the globe.
You are not just a viewer, you are helping keep these memories alive. Tell us your location.
Tell us if someone in your family served. Just let us know you are here. Thank you for watching and for helping ensure Mel Grevich and John Little do not fade into silence. These men deserve to be remembered, and you are helping make that happen.